The Bellwether Dispatch. Week the 2nd, Part the 1st. What it is, and what it is not, being the same thing. It is well before dawn, and snowing with fine sugar, as I head down the mountain path on my way to the abandoned mill for my second instance at the finger post, that tiresome, erroneous, charitable deed of mine, my Ronald Vinegar Sunday mornings. I am wrapped in a heavy shawl, which I call a shawl but is really my main bed blanket, but this commute of mine is a good enough, rotten enough time to tell you more fully of the origins of the dispatch and in general what I know of Ronald Vinegar. I could start, I suppose, with the Vinegar name itself. Apparently, Ronald and his parents, and likely their ancestors back through time, took pains to emphasize both the vine and the gar, that it should be vine-gar. Yet no one could accept this lesson, and so the vine-gars were never called anything but the Vinegars. For a while, late in the 19th century, the Vinegars made wooden matches at the mill when there was money in matches, and then they switched to crutches when it made sense to do so, and then they briefly attempted baseball bats when it didn't. But as their bat design was based on a cartoon sketch of a bat found in an English satire magazine, they made only very strange ones of these, with double handles and bulbous ends, and soon went out of business. Ronald Vinegar's parents died, or more perversely, disappeared, as Ronald himself one day would do. But regardless, Ronald was left the mill, and 700 crutches, and many, many boxes of very old matches, and a great number of satiric baseball bats. As a boy in the early 1890s, it is said that Ronald Vinegar traveled with his parents to a World's Fair in some part of the country, where he bore witness to the lectures and demonstrations of inventors and idea people who took to makeshift stages and made great, grand, sweeping gestures with their arms, which swished the tails of their long jackets and shouted fine things, and lastly unveiled startling machines to the astonished cries of gathered crowds. And in short, it was here that young Ronald consumed a wild banquet of arguments about the wondrous roads the world would soon travel down. Ronald returned from the World's Fair dazzled and empty, and intent on being the sort of boy who would become the sort of man who would one day stand upon a makeshift stage and make great arm gestures that swished the tails of his coat while shouting fine things and eventually unveiling a cry-worthy machine, all of which would electrify such boys as he himself then was. He tried his young hand at mechanical devices and his older hand at rudimentary engines, and some of his early drawings for flying sticks and enormous clouds made of paper still survive, along with hundreds and hundreds of drawings for a kind of spaceship rocket that Ronald Vinegar apparently called the Moon Fellow, which fellow he hoped might one day fetch him to the moon. And it is supposed by the few people who care about such things that Ronald Vinegar's lecture on revolutionary topics would have consisted largely of his careful arguments against a continued life in Lemon and indeed the planet Earth, and that here, during his lecture, he hoped to gather support for a proposed mission to the moon. He would have closed his talk with the spectacular flourish of unveiling Moonfellow itself. And further and finally, those who know suggest it would have been his great, daring finale to invite the entire town to join him. That Ronald Vinegar's life's work and finest dream was to bring the entire population of Lemon along with him on the 300,000-mile journey, that they might, all for one and one for all, together colonize the moon. Ronald Vinegar's unattended lecture occurred sometime in the middle of the summer of 1914. Why he issued his invitation to this lecture on postcards featuring fairy tale gentlemen, I cannot say. But he delivered these postcards by hand to all the residents in town, and it was said to take him 3 days of inefficient roving to do so. And as well, he turned, as best he could, the former crutch factory into an auditorium and makeshift stage. He brought in chairs and made benches and laid out punch bowls full of lemonade and propped the front doors open with a barrel of beer, which barrel he soon regretted not making brighter mention of in his postcard invitation. At the very last moment, only minutes before the lecture was to start, and even though not a single early bird had arrived to do justice to the notion that anyone ever would, he set up a candle-powered spotlight of his own devising and went to stand in its minor flicker on the stage, and there, bathed in mildly magnified candle flame, he waited. Eventually, we must gather, his puny spotlight guttered out, and Ronald, dimmed in all ways, belittled, in fact, must have made his way to the propped-open front door to look outside and into the fields, hopefully for possibly late-arriving lecture-goers, and seeing none, began to consume the entire barrel of beer. When finally drunk enough and angry enough and tired enough, he went raging off through town to discover the reason for such a special lack of interest in his revolutionary topics. It was said that he got into heated debates in many doorsteps, and that he proposed a dozen fist-fights in a half-a-dozen meadows, and that, for some unknown reason, he made many arm movements that swished the tails of his jacket while loudly uninviting his fresh enemies to join him on board the Moonfellow and the great voyage into space. Whatever the truth, he was soon arrested and was ordered to issue his apology to the citizens of Lemon, and he did this on the same fairy-tale postcards, and, as before, hand-delivered each one to every resident in town. None of these apology postcards survive, I'm afraid, but with the original invitation cards, they were to change the course of his life. For, several days after delivering his apology postcards, Ronald Vinegar himself received a postcard from the widow Agnes Keller, one of the oldest, and it is said most cheerful, women in Lemon. Widow Keller confessed that she had quite enjoyed Ronald's 2 postcards, both invitation and apology, and she wondered if he might consider sending more postcards to her on a regular schedule, perhaps weekly. Could they, she wondered, he and she, begin a postcard correspondence, with the only caveat being that she herself would likely never write him back? Though sadly none of these Widow Keller postcards survive, they were to be Ronald Vinegar's first successful venture as far as doing something that someone else in the world approved and wanted and did not find excessively peculiar. Without a struggle, and quite soon, Ronald had 6 or 7 local subscribers to these Widow Keller postcards, most of them the Widow Keller's friends, and weekly he would write a new postcard to the widow and then copy it out for each of his subscribers and go off and deliver them. He was not paid for this, but did believe that he detected the beginnings of a market of sorts in the notion of such a subscription-based correspondence. But then early in 1915, the Widow Keller died, and with that, suddenly and temporarily, so did Ronald Vinegar's curious career as a postcard service provider. But he'd struck upon a model that he quite liked, and for the next year he struggled to come up with a subscribable postcard that would prove profitable. His business plan was simple. Everything would be free until something caught fire, at which point he would begin to charge a small service fee. He had mild success, in the form of 35 subscribers, with his postcard series, The Review of Impossibly Spotted Birds, which humorously or insanely recounted his weekly sightings of exotic birds that could never be found in Lemon. There is one surviving example of this, again printed on the same fairy tale gentleman postcard, and it reads thusly: I saw high in the tree the lone wild pelican with his marvelous questing sailboat of a beak. He looked as dubiously down at me as I at him, as though to say, Mine eyes were not made to see thee, and I am far too old to learn to see thee, and I will make do with a lie of sorts inside my pigeon head, and therefore you are to me as a kind of stone with eyes, and as I look away, as I will now, I will forget thee forever as a stone, in favour of not knowing thee at all. P.S. Ronald Vinegar finished with a postscript, which all then proves to your humble correspondent that seeing parrots is as hard for a man from Lemon as seeing a man from Lemon is for parakeets. The latter, I have been told, is an example of one of the many quirks particular to Ronald Vinegar, that he struggled his whole life to keep certain obvious facts, such as the names of birds, straight, that nothing in Ronald Vinegar's world that began as a pelican could remain so without at some point becoming a parrot and finally a parakeet. Greater success was found with his postcard series, Where the Fish Are, in which Ronald professed to understand the natural desires of different edible fish in local rivers and lakes, and which shallows and deeps they could be found in on certain days. This series garnered in a flash over 100 subscribers, all fishermen we might assume, and lasted only a few short weeks before word got out that Ronald Vinegar had never fished a day in his life and could not spell properly the names of any of the lakes and rivers in town, and that most of the fish he claimed to be on intimate terms with, such as the flounder and the killer whale, were not natural to the local wetland habitat. It was at this point in 1916 that Ronald Vinegar was approached by Deacon Day, the editor of the Lemon Times. Day was not particularly interested in anything Vinegar had to say on the subject of anything, and like most in town, believed him to be a fool and do nothing. But Day was desperate to include the very modern feature of a weather report in his paper. His readers wanted one, and so Day did. Deacon Day's true quarry here, however, was in fact the head librarian of the Lemon Library, Miss Mary Bellwether, who was said to be the greatest and most solidly eccentric beauty in the land, a shut-in as well, as Mary Bellwether would live her entire life inside her library home with an as-yet, then undiagnosed, agoraphobia. As to the latter, there is one legendary Mary Bellwether phrase that survives locally to this day. For it seems that Mary's friends, and even the patrons of the library, unable to fully appreciate her fear of the world, often attempted to draw her out of doors, to which she famously, steadily replied over the years, "I will not go out until out is in." Let's see here. First you find the door, hope you have the key, and then get out. Tiptoe through the tailpipe, listen to the whisper and the shout. And then you turn around, you do a ballet thing, a pirouette. It's like you're going home, but it's an echo of a headless tete-a-tete. You go out, and then in. It's like you're outside in. You go out, and then in. It's like you're outside in. I will not go out until out is in. Walking through Lemon, you will still occasionally hear this phrase used as a local wise expression of one's resistance to some paradoxical force. But regardless, Day knew of Mary Bellwether's gifts as a psychic, and had recently heard that villagers had for many years been consulting the librarian on all matters spiritual and esoteric, from communicating with the dead to guidance in their hunts for the treasure of Amory Snow to clues about the coming weather. As the story went, for some time Mary Bellwether made use of a crystal ball to divine all the secrets of the world, but at some point, at least in terms of weather forecasting, she'd switched tools and gotten her hands on a Fitzroy stormglass and learned how to use it. Deacon Day had himself personally approached Mary Bellwether at her library, suggesting the notion of her composing a regular weather report column for his paper, and she had, without a moment's hesitation, demurred, apparently thinking that any such official post might eventually draw her out of doors or negatively impact her status as a psychic. But though Deacon Day had been dismissed, he did not give up. And he had a backup plan based upon another fragment of gossip that he'd gleaned. For Mary Bellwether, aside from her other sufferings, and mostly in secret, was desperately in love with Ronald Vinegar, and it should be no surprise that Ronald Vinegar, so constantly clueless, so wrong about fish, and so ill-suited to the calamitous fixity of the names of birds, had neither any idea of this nor any established means of reciprocity. And so Deacon Day's proposal to Ronald Vinegar was, in fact, his roundabout, rascally way of getting Ronald Vinegar to do his dirty work, to procure, via Vinegar, a regular weather report from Bellwether, with her heart the soft, reliable tool of leverage. To which offer Ronald Vinegar replied, as has been stated, "I am afraid I can be of no service there." At which point there was some lengthy pause, in which Deacon Day reconfigured his operation before slowly putting on his hat and sadly turning away, while whispering as to himself as he departed, "Of course, Ronald, as you wish, though she is quite in love with you." At which point Ronald Vinegar was said to grow quite tall, and upon reaching an unexpected height, then made the instant request that Deacon Day allow him to retract his earlier testimony, and that further, upon a second thought, he would like nothing better in the world than to provide the newspaper with a regular dispatch from Mary Bellwether, if that, in fact, would be of use. Avalanches crashing down Pomore, another last page in the middle of a story. They said never follow any wild men, learn from all them people who went silent. But today your only homework's the horizon. The sky and earth are quietly colliding. You can't take the music from a violin. You can't make a wing from something flying. But you can make an ocean from an island. Find a life inside the roaring wild. Today your only homework's the horizon. The sky and earth are quietly colliding. Rotors 1, 2, 3. Rotors start. M, C, K. Rings. A.
And all of those messages were encoded using Enigma machines, so cracking Enigma was the key.
Ronald Vinegar must have visited Mary Bellwether at the library at some point and inveigled her support for what she must have thought was a new postcard service. She likely knew only too well of his struggles, and perhaps had taken pity on him, or, in the furtherance of her own feeling, was only too happy to work on something with him, if only that they might come closer together. Yet their mode of operation, as mutually worked out, made no use of intimate proximity. Instead, early Sunday mornings, Mary Bellwether would descend into the basement of the library, where she would consult her Fitzroy storm glass and possibly her crystal ball. She would then type up her weather prefigurements for the next 7 days on an old calligraph, a sort of forerunner to the modern typewriter, massive and dripping with oil and smelling like the inside of a locomotive. The calligraph, I should mention, is notable for lacking the letter Q, and for obscuring the very document being composed by means of a series of bars, which must be lifted away to see if what one has just written bears any resemblance to what one hopes. With her agoraphobia, Mary Bellwether could not deliver her report to Ronald Vinegar, and instead, on that very first Sunday, sent one of her library girls to deliver it for her. The 14-year-old girl was meant to rush across the library meadow, bound over the rock wall, past the church, and go up through town, cross the Grassel family field, and head up along the river to the mill and deliver the report to Ronald Vinegar, whereupon Ronald would retype it up on the postcards and deliver it to Deacon Day at the Lemon Times before 7 a.m., as per Day's publishing requirement. Things went according to plan for hardly any length of time, for it would appear that the postcard girl, Anna Lee Cottis, had very poor vision or was very clumsy and stumbled in the fresh bulwark of snow in the library field and twisted her ankle. But she must have spied the local pastor in the church and, unable to complete her task, and for some young person reason, began to call out, which he was able to read from Mary Bellwether's note, with the further instruction that she would be very obliged if the vicar might somehow convey this information along to Ronald Vinegar at the mill. Now the vicar was famous for his pair of mutually negating qualities, that of being extremely helpful and terribly lazy. Desperate always to help, he had very little else to add to the equation, aside from anxiety that he could do so little. But in this case, the vicar managed to pass along his duty to the frail old man who swept the church. So now the old church sweep had the baton and went ambling away into the snow. But as with Anna Lee Cottis before him, the old church sweep never completed his task, for at some point along the way, his very frailness and age brought him crashing down in the snow. Sadly, he would not survive the tumble, but lived on long enough only to pass the weather report, as he'd heard it from the vicar, on to a young, adventure-seeking woman who was mute and from out of town, and who happened to be walking along the frozen Lemon River, and who saw him and came to his aid. This innocent bystander and good Samaritan went to fetch help, and then went on to the mill to pass along the dying whispers of the old church sweep. But as she could not talk, she had to make do with writing down the old man's whispers with her very cold, numb fingers. And so the substance of that very first Bellwether Dispatch was created through this series of breakdowns and ambushings of the line of communication. It is a message delivered by the numb fingers of a stranger's best guess, of an old man's dying words, poorly recalled from a vicar's apprehension of something shouted through a rock wall by an injured girl with poor vision, as originally composed on a machine that lacked the letter Q. A great living game of telephone tag, you will have guessed. Ronald Vinegar, of course, had no idea how deeply tampered with his first weather report was, but when he did shortly find out the conspiracy of incidents that composed it, he is said to have, as he did when learning of Mary Bellwether's admiration of him, grown quite tall. He found it a deep pleasure and a miracle, and he insisted that all further iterations of the Bellwether Dispatch follow exactly this course of bifurcating injustice as close as possible. How successful he was in this, it is hard to say, but it is known that at least 3 of the original participants, Mary Bellwether, Anna Lee Cottis, and even the vicar himself, were willing accomplices of the 4 Bellwether dispatches that were dispatched. And so, 100 years later, with the assistance of Sarah Bellwether, the current librarian and granddaughter of Mary, and 5 others, including myself, that is in fact the current structure of our reenactment. From librarian's calligraph to 14-year-old girl stumble, to lazy parish priest, to near-dead elder janitor, to innocent bystander, to me. There are those in town who say that the Bellwether Dispatch is itself a Bellwether Dispatch, nothing but a story handed down over a century to such a point that it's become a thing it never was, as rendered by old machines, rock walls, lazy memories, dying breaths, and numb fingers. So we may be left to wonder if the history we have of the Bellwether Dispatch, indeed the general history that we carry along in the sporty ballparks of our brains, is nothing more than a wildly painted mountain of a thing that began life as a common field. Those curious about inaccurate weather reports, or eager to uncover a portion of the buried treasure of Amory Snow, or those who simply like postcards or subscribing to things that are free, may sign up by sending their name and address to bellwetherdispatch@gmail.com. If you would like only to see the postcard, make that intent known, and you will be given a secret address from the internet, which shall reveal it. Each postcard, real and virtual, will contain clues to a small pleasing treasure to be found somewhere in New Hampshire. A bag of doubloons is what the contents most resemble from the days of Amory Snow. Those finding the treasure are requested to take only a single sample of what is to be found, and to leave the rest for others. Finally, the only payment the town of Lemon requires is that you send photographic proof of your treasure finding, of yourself with the treasure at the secret treasure site, and that you send such images to bellwetherdispatch@gmail.com, that we here in Lemon might then proselytize in this manner, and achieve the great profit from multiplying 7 billion by the cost of stamps and subtracting that by a figure otherwise known as 0. Further information about the treasure hunt and postcards may be found at radioghost.com. Lastly, these rains of strong, strong bees. P.S. Infinity.